is it in assignments? I thought it was in assignments. Okay, so the first question, what do we use Maven for? Everybody should have got this. Building dependency management. There's obviously more you can do with Maven than just building dependency management, but in the context of this class, that's what we use it for. Next question, what is the purpose of a managed bean? I know I talked about this Thursday, interacting with our facelets, class attribute access, method calling. Basically, it's a model for our UI, right? So we use our managed beans for form handling and for accessing our other layers and sending that data back to UI. Next one, we can only use the JSF built-in tag library when building our facelets. Of course, the answer is false. Prime Faces is an example of this, as well as there's a lot of other JSF tag libraries that we can incorporate. But if you remember Prime Faces, then this should have been pretty easy. Like I said, I think all of you heard my announcement last week, but if you didn't, this was marked incorrectly the first 24 hours the quiz was open. So if you filled it out and got it wrong and I haven't updated it, just shoot me an email or come see me and I'll adjust your grade for that and just give you the points back. Number 4, how do I register a class with JSF? If you guys recall, we have to annotate with the @managedBean annotation and specify a name and then either true or false. Managed property is, of course, how we reference or how we specify that a property of our class is going to be accessible to the facelet. And then finally, how many layers exist in a JSF application? 3-tiered architecture, 3. You guys will see, I think I pushed more packages in over the weekend. If not, you'll see tonight. There's like 7 packages in our application now. I know that trips some people up. The packages that live in our application are not indicative of how many layers are in our application, right, in the architecture. So I could put 30 packages. That means that it's just organization of my classes. Okay, cool. Let me see. Where did we fail at here? Completion error. Yeah, I don't know what the deal is with this. No, this is not by design at all. You know, my other Mac works fine, so it's not a Mac thing. I've got like 3 versions of IntelliJ on here, you know, so I think that there's just a setting that got corrupted. I could reinstall and try it again, but I don't really care that much. Okay, so first we're going to go ahead and just fire up our Tomcat and make sure that I didn't break anything tinkering with this on Sunday. Okay, I did. But I believe I know what the problem is. Go to our POM. Has anybody else run into weird dependency issues with your Maven dependencies and your some of your libraries? Is it just me? Okay. Yeah, so as I've been adding some of these libraries and things, IntelliJ has not been handling them well. So if you guys run into the same issue, please let me know and we'll get that taken care of. Okay, cool. Alright, so interfaces. Like I said, an interface, you guys have all done interfaces in computer programming too, right? So you're familiar with the core concept of an interface and how we use them and what they're for. To recap, an interface is basically it almost acts like a contract for the implementing classes, right? So if I have an interface for a data class, I can dictate, all right, every class that implements this interface has to implement these methods. Now, where does this come into handy in our project? Take, for example, the DAO class. I can create a standard DAO interface that, what was that? No, you're fine. You're fine. I can create a standard DAO interface and say that every DAO object must implement a get all, a search by, add, delete, and basically all of my CRUD operations. I can specify that every class that implements that interface has to have these methods. Now, the other part of that is that anytime we create a new class, it should implement an interface. Not necessarily every time, but in this context, like with our DAO class, we can make sure that, as part of the coding standards, that it implements an interface. So, one really easy thing to do here is in IntelliJ we can actually pull out our interface. So if we go to, we right click on our class, refactor. So if we right click on our class, go to refactor, extract, interface, we can pull out the interface for our class. Now, there's a couple different ways we can do this. We can have 6 interfaces for each DAO class, right? So I could have a groups interface, I could have a user interface, I could have a cars interface, or I can make one standard interface that specifies all the CRUD operations that we'll need, so create, read, and update, and then implement our other methods around that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify IDAO. So as you guys remember, when we create interfaces, we always want to prefix the name with I, interface name. And I'm just going to not specify any of these member functions. Yes. Cool. Alright, so I have an empty interface. Now, because our DAO package is, we're using it for pulling our data, what are some methods that need to go in here? I would assume a So I would assume a get all objects method. I would assume a public boolean, or actually we'll make that a void. I would assume a I would assume an add, so we have our create, we have a read. So and this will, all of these will throw just generic exceptions. Oh, yep, that's it. I'll have another one for public void update object. Is there anything else we think we'll need to do to interface with our XML at this point? So we have create, read, update, and delete. Is there anything else? No? All right. So now what we can do, now that we have our interface, we can go ahead and change our existing classes, and we can say, so actually IntelliJ has already done it for me, but what we would do is come in and specify, okay, user DAO implements IDAO. Any other DAO classes that we specify will have to implement these methods. Now, a couple things that we can do to get rid of these errors is update this to get all objects and specify the @override. Don't you like about that? Oh, I see what I did. Okay, so we've updated our get all objects. You know what? That may be neat. No, in get all objects, that returns a list of objects. It's choking on the type. So, we may need to make this generic here. Let's just do this. For simplicity's sake, let's go ahead and just create an interface for each DAO class. Get all users, add user, update user, delete. And then that's just got to be updated to user. I see what I did. Okay. All right. What was that?
When you try make a new one, it goes right under the parent, it makes it the parent.
Yeah. And it really does that for cases where we have interclasses, right? So if I have 6 interclasses, it'll show me what classes live in that file. However, in cases like interfaces, we're not going to have nested interfaces or anything. So it's kind of like, why collapse like that? Okay, so does not override from the... oh, I see what I did. Okay. User DAO. Alright, so we have our get all users method now. Now we just need to unhandled exception. Okay, so get user by username. So now we just need to add our other methods in here. So I already have an add user method, so really all I have to do is first specify the override and update this user. So the override specifies that we are implementing an interfaces or parents method, but we're overriding it, right? So it tells us that, or it tells the compiler that, okay, I created an add user method. This method is not a separate method from iUserDAO's add user. I'm just adding the implementation for it, or I'm changing the implementation for it. The same thing works with just general inheritance. So if I have user DAO that extends DAO, I can override and add objects in the same manner. In the case of the inheritance, by default, if I don't override it, my extending class will use the method of the superclass. So if I have a get all users in the superclass, when I call get all users for user DAO, we'll actually call the superclasses method, which could have adverse side effects depending upon what the expectation is. So we've added that. Now we need to add an update user, or an update user method, whoops, and specify user, and then user. So I would like to make a point that see how much more difficult it is for me to go back through and change something to add an interface after the fact versus doing a little bit of thought beforehand, creating my interface, and then letting the IDE implement all of my methods. So like these last two, because I haven't filled them in yet, all I had to do was tell the IDE, okay, I want to implement these methods, and it stubbed them in for me. So pretty easy. So we'll leave these blank for now. So now we got to go in and do the same to. Okay, what are you mad about? Exception to method signature. Okay. And you're freaking out about the same thing. Okay. All right. Now what's interesting here is that when we first wrote this interface, we weren't able to, and I'll have to do a little digging as to why this is, but when we first wrote our interface, I had specified, okay, this returns a list of objects. Well, a user is a subclass of object, so I can't do that. But when it comes to throwing the exception, down here, like on this get all users function, or I'm sorry, method, even though there's a chance of throwing well, I guess there's no chance in this one. That's a bad example. Okay, yeah, so like an add user. The interface specifies that this can throw a just generic exception. However, we can specify, okay, this will throw a JAX-B exception because it's a subclass of exception. But I can't return a list of user objects even though I'm returning a list of objects. So, one of the reasons I don't like Java. All of these rules like that. Anyway, so, yeah, you know what I'm talking about, right? You know, I actually asked Hazim about it, or Hazim, and he told me basically no. The short answer was no because you guys learned Java up until this point. I get learning Java. I don't get teaching JSF because not a lot of companies outside of like PCMS still use JSF. I work on Flask every day, so Flask Python with Angular. Most of the other companies I've worked for use Node or use whatever have you, but not a lot of people are using JSF anymore. Yeah. A lot of your older and established companies are using JSF because that's what people in the 90s were using. But because there's so much out there that's so much easier to use, everybody's converting to Python, everybody's converting to Node.js. I actually hate JavaScript server frameworks. Like Node, I hate it simply because, okay, what Node does is it passes the workload to the client machine because it's all JavaScript. I don't like that though, because we have all of this ability in the cloud with load balancing and with auto scaling groups behind a load balancer. You guys taking cloud classes? Is this going over your head? All right, can I work the smart board? Because this is kind of relevant to our architecture here. Does anybody know how to work the smart board? No?
Still your Sharpie.
It's not even hooked up.
Just pull that up.
Yeah, let's do that. Okay. No? All right, so how do I... Okay, so that's there, but then why doesn't it... Let's do this in class. All right. We're going to have to let that move. All right. So you guys are going to have to go. Okay, so you guys don't know anything about concept, virtualization, or is this all new concept? All right, you guys looked at AWS before? Okay, so you know what EC2 is, right? EC2 is just a standard compute instance in the cloud. So basically, the concept of load balancing is that we have, so in our standard, like an old school PHP environment, you would have something, you would have a standalone web server running, say, Apache. So you would be running your LAMP stack or your LAMP stack, or whatever. So you have Apache, Linux box, with PHP, MySQL, and then your user controls, right? And then what would happen is a user request would come in, would be sent to Apache, would then return PHP. And then you can balance that a little bit by adding additional nodes and things like that. But what you would do is you would do that through a virtual host on your main landing page, right? So if this was, you know, let's see, what would happen is that you would have these boxes behind that that do pretty much the same thing, right? That have the same stack, maybe not, maybe this just forwards these boxes back here. That's about as close as we got to load balancing back in the PHP days. Fast forward to today, so now you have a okay, so fast forward to today, now we have this concept of what's known as load balancing. So load balancer is a server that accepts incoming requests. Your load balancer is what actually is registered with data service. So your load balancer is registered at www.uc.edu, and that just contains a load balancer software, whether that be like Amazon's proprietary or whatever you spin up. But what load balancer does is very similar to what was happening before, in that our request comes in, draw an arrow, and identifies, okay, so each one of these boxes back here has your application running on it. In the case of our JSF application, each one of these boxes would have a JSF application running with a front end or back end, a web server to take that, to handle that request. So what would happen is the load balancer request comes in and it says, all right, what was the last box I sent this to? Send it to this one, and then the next request comes in, send it to that one, send it to that one, and then okay, I've got a fourth request. All right, so go back to the top one, node place, send it to the first one, and so on and so forth. That way, your website will scale as your user base grows, right? So if I have 3 nodes and each node can handle 100,000 users, that's a pretty good assumption, but let's assume that. Now, because we're load balancing, we can actually handle 300,000 users without this box being overloaded at first and then falling back to this one. Now, this concept of auto scaling, and Amazon does a really good this. What auto-scaling says is, all right, what's happening is we're monitoring our RAM and CPU. So say this box is at 80% CPU, 70% RAM, say 50, 40, 50, 40. So what's happening with the auto-scaling software is we're monitoring, okay, what is our utilization of our load balance nodes? And say this guy, say the threshold for this is 69, 79. All right, well this node just went over the threshold for being overloaded. So what your cloud provider like AWS would do is say, okay, that's not a problem. I'm going to spin up another node so that our load gets cut on all of these other boxes by a factor, call it half. It's probably not half, but call it half. So now we're running 25 and 20, 25, 20, and then all this 40, 45. And then this guy would presumably assume, this guy would take on a load of something like 40, 45. So as your website grows, so does your, or as your utilization of your site grows, so do your load balance nodes, therefore you have a load balance space. Now the inverse is true, is let's say that this is running 5, 2, let's say 2 and 2, my markers, shit, so just bear with me. Say 5 and 7, 5 and 7, and say, basically, unlike in a traditional data center, we wanted to build big to handle whatever came at us, right? So in a traditional data center, we would have these $10,000 or $20,000 massive boxes with 200 gigs of RAM, a shit ton of processors, just in case we ever need them. Well, the cloud's different. The cloud, I can spin something up in 45 seconds. I don't need to spin up big. I need to spin up little. So what happens is, if our utilization is decreased, what our auto-scaling group will do is just go in and we'll go in and kill 2 of our boxes, right? So now our load has gone up to maximize utilization, right? So say we're now at 4, 4. So then our load balancer waits the amount of time monitors, and if we're still underutilized, we're just going to kill another box, cut our number of boxes in half. So now we're going to say 28, 20. But then what an auto-scaling group can also do is make sure there's always at least one box running in the region of availability zone. Do you guys know that availability zones? I know some of those. We don't really need to cover that. I mean, this is all anecdotal on this one, but that's why Node.js actually like moving over to the client side.
But by moving the load to the client side, what you do gain is you gain more fault tolerance for network instability issues.
That's true. However, in my opinion, there's very few cases where you're going to run into network stability issues.
I don't know. That's one from the other.
Okay, well, that's an entirely different story. I'm thinking, say you're sitting here at UC. UC has Node.js apps on its network, right? No one on this campus has that bad of a network connection that we really need to pass the workload on to the user, right? Slap it in the cloud, put it behind the load balancer, put an auto-scaling group on top of that. Nobody's ever going to run into these issues. That's just my opinion. But now you guys know about load balancing. So, and the cool thing is load balancing is dependent of our software and dependent of our application, right? I can do load balancing with CGI and C++. That is a thing, for the record. You can build a web page with C++. It's horrible. Don't ever do it. But it's possible. Come on. Exactly, and that's the other thing, right? So, unlike in a traditional data center where I'm paying a shit ton out of the box and then maybe a minor fee to maintain it, with load balancing, I pay for what I use. So if I'm a startup that has almost no traffic until I go to, say, reInvent. Say I go to reInvent and my user base triples. Okay, well, with load balancing and auto scaling, I didn't pay for all of the stuff I didn't need before, but now that I'm a massive corporation about to get bought out by, say, Amazon or Google, I can handle my load without really needing to change my architecture. Okay. So I read where I was going with that, so let's just jump back into interfaces. Long story short, we should teach Python in this class. Don't screw with Node.js. I know it's cool and I know it's flashy, but I think it has a limited lifetime because of passing all of that work to the client. Not only that, but if your user, you remember back in like the early 2000s, they told everybody to disable your JavaScript because it was a security threat. There's still a lot of people that do that, even people in the tech industry. So I know guys that are cloud administrators that still disable their JavaScript. So that's the other problem with Node.js is if I as a user disable my JavaScript, your site doesn't work. So something to think about. Okay, so login service is choking, and I don't know why. Missing return statement. Okay. So, what are you choking about now? Okay. Okay, so now we've fixed all of our red lines. We've almost fixed our red lines. And that's another reason we usually want to just create the interface first and then create our implementing class. We can always add to the interface and add. We can always add to the interface and add to the implementing class, but we don't want to create the implementing class and then extract the interface. I mean, we can. The IDE lets us, but think about if there was 100 classes in this, and you're coming into a new project that somebody's been building for 10 years. Just easier, build the interface first, specify the implementing methods, or the methods to implement. Okay, so we've done all of that. We'll go ahead and redeploy just to make sure we didn't break anything. Okay, so can I still log in? Okay, I can still log in. So, as it appears, I didn't break anything. One cool thing, and I'll talk about this a little bit on Thursday, is the unit testing with Infinity Test, or Infinite Test. Basically, anytime we make a change, we will run our unit test and have the ability to validate that nothing broke, right? So instead of having to go through and actually log into the UI and test everything, I can run my unit test and be sure that I'm solid in that regard. Okay, so now we need to go back through and repeat the process for vehicles DAO. So we never actually even cleaned this up and made it XML friendly. So let's take 5 minutes and do that. Actually, let's just rewrite this class entirely because it should be pretty easy to do. Well, first, let's refactor this into get all cars. Then we're just going to break that all anyway. So what I can do is I can specify. So like I said earlier, we can do refactor, extract, interface. I've gone ahead and commented out our old nasty hand parsing XML method. So really all we're doing is extracting an interface. We're calling it IB equals DAO. And we're, what are we, okay. And then we're just renaming here. Stupid, okay. So now, same process as before, but we don't have to worry about breaking any implementations, so we'll specify list car data source. So we'll specify a get all cars method. We'll specify an add car method. Car. Wait, that's already done. We'll specify a delete car method. What are we choking on here? Oh, public void update car. If I can type. It's not the Mac keyboard. I actually can't type to save my life on the Windows ones. So, just so we're clear.
Windows one has improved my typing.
See, the Mac one improved mine. If I was sitting, it wouldn't even be a problem. But all right.
That's a real thing. I can understand this really.
A lot of people like the standing desk. I had one. I hated it. I've had a couple. I hated them all. I've never been a fan. I would sit up here, but this stupid chair only comes up to my knee. Yeah, I don't care that much. It's an hour out of my day. So we're still redlining on our vehicles DAO class. So we'll just option return, implement methods, select all of our methods that we want to implement, and now we have implemented all of our methods, which are just basically stubbed in at this point.
This is, I don't know if you know this, but the old topic that we have Java doc things. I was wondering if you build Java docs for this, since this is interface, would you actually have the Java doc? If you generated the Java documentation, ID equals DAO, have these methods with Java docs, and with the vehicles DAO, would you see the interfaces Java docs? You have to copy what you see.
If you were to select copy Java doc, you should see the Java doc for it.
But
If you
didn't copy it, you built it, and it knows it's an interface with a copy of that.
I think it would take the interface Java doc, or maybe it would take it would take the overriding Java doc.
But if you didn't, you would take the interface route.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Just a little side note, yeah. For my grading, really, as long as your interface is documented well enough for me to understand it, I don't really care if there's Java doc. I mean, obviously I want inline comments and header comments, but if you're overriding an interface and your interface is commented correctly, I'm not going to dock you on not having comments here. As you guys have seen in class, I don't write comments, period. But don't do as I say, not as I do. Okay, so I've stubbed out, or I've implemented all of our CRUD operations for our vehicles. Now, I can do a couple things. I can spend the next 5 or 10 minutes converting this over to the new XML, but I think you guys have already seen that. I think you guys are comfortable with that, right? So the next topic I want to cover is this concept of stubbing, right? So how do I create a new method or create a new interface with methods, create a new class that implements those, but I don't know how that's going to look yet. I know my return type and I know what's going to happen, but how do I basically stub it in at this point? So, pretty easy concept. You guys, those of you that have had Brandon, I believe, have done this already, right? Android, he makes you write stubs. So, remember the core use case for my Java app, right? When this is all said and done, I want to be able to harvest data from Craigslist to find new and used cars. So we've done a lot of stuff locally, but my app doesn't really do anything unless I can actually troll Craigslist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just stub in my networking methods. That way we know they're there. That way we can call them where they're appropriately used. But we can also come back through later and actually wire them up to network calls. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new package called networking. And I'm going to create a new Java class, or I'm going to create a new Java interface, and I'm going to call it iCar HTTP. And what this interface is going to do for me is this interface will actually be wired up later, but what this will do is this will actually send off my call to Craigslist API or whatever API I want to hit. I mean, at this point, it can be anything. I can hit Rock Auto, but pull back my data and then parse it, which would then call so basically it'll pull the data back, parse it into car objects, and then I can pass that to my DAO class to actually add that to my database or XML. So for right now, I'm going to have a public list car get car data. Now, a couple things that I probably want to do here, right? So number one, I got to think ahead because I'm writing my interface. What kind of things would this method need to specify, right? So if I'm going off and you guys know about APIs, right? Or is that foreign concept? Okay. So if I was going to hit an API, well, I'm not going to, Craigslist or whatever isn't going to have an API endpoint that knows what I want. So I need to build an additional method or incorporate this into my current method, basically a way to add some parameters, right? So I could do this in a couple different ways. I think the easiest would be to basically pass a map of query params. And by specifying a map, so you guys obviously know HTTP, post, get, params, it's just a dictionary, right? Even though it changes my URL at the top, at the end of the day, it's just a dictionary or a map or a hash map. But what I can do is I can pass in a map of query parameters. What I can do is I can pass a map of query parameters, and then when I go to actually implement that, I can iterate over my key value pairs and get a key and a value that will correlate to my HTTP arguments. So what else do I need here? Well, I probably also need to specify a string that dictates my API endpoint, or my API, yeah, my API endpoint, right? So I have my server, I'll have a base URL for my server, but I also need to specify what my API endpoint is going to be. So I'm going to say string endpoint, and just add some comments. And then this will throw an exception. Okay, so I've specified, so I built my first method, which is my get all car data. So what other methods do I need to specify in order to hit an API? Right? I'm probably not going to, be sending data, right? Because assuming I didn't write the API, I'm never really going to be executing update or delete or create methods. So this is probably fine, but what if our API requires some kind of authentication? No, I'm thinking like a lot of times, like with the Facebook with the Facebook API, I have to pass in my user ID, my password, and then I get a session token or an auth token back. So I want to add a method in here to preemptively go and get my session token that I can wire up for my next request. So I'm not entirely sure how this is going to look when I implement it, but what I can be pretty sure that it's going to be a string. So I have a method that'll get a string, and we'll call it doAuth, and then string. We'll say string API key, string API secret, string endpoint. And so what I've done is I'm making an assumption that my doAuth method will require an API key, a secret key, and an endpoint. Well, that's not always true. Take New Relic. Have you guys heard of New Relic before? So New Relic is a server or application monitoring platform in the cloud. And basically what you do is you install their software as either a library in your app or as a standalone agent on your cloud servers, and they send a bunch of data back to their monitoring database that allows you to log in through dashboard and see trending, see data trending and all of that. But in the case of New Relic, I don't have to specify a secret key. All I have to do is specify just a plain API key. So how could I accommodate that? Because I don't want to always have to specify two keys. I don't want to pass in an empty string. I could set it to null, but what's the more Java kosher way to do this? What was that? I could do a constant. I'm think a little more outside of the box here from CP2. What's one of the big selling points of Java in methods? I have the ability to override. So what I can do is I can override this method, or I'm sorry, not override, overload. So I can overload this method, and I can have two do-outs, one that only takes a string API key, and one that takes a string API key, a string API secret, and a string endpoint. Or I can have one that just takes a string API key and an endpoint. But because I can overload, I'm going to add one more just to cover all of my bases. I'm going to say username. Oh, I see. Okay, so that should be fine. So what I could also stub in, if I had a username password combination, I could also stub in username is my API key and password is my other one. I would imagine most APIs don't do username password anymore, so I'm not going to worry about that. I won't worry about adding comments. Is there anything else that I need to do in order to use this networking class? So are there any other methods we can think of that I'll need to get my raw car data? Or any other methods I would want? Do a what? Yeah, and realistically, when we implement our get car data, we could just specify that we're going to use the post method versus get. That will wire up later. But for right now, the only other thing I want to add is a public string get post data or get car. And what I want to do with this one is I'm just using Craigslist as an example. So Craigslist has, obviously I can search and use query parameters and parse that to get my car data out. But say I found a car that I like, but I want to know the details of the post. Well, I'll need to send another API request to get the full description, the price, the contact, all of that. So I want to specify a get car details method and basically plug in the same parameters as I do in my get all car data, but in this case we're going to plug in a post ID and all of that. So now what I can do is I can create a new implementing class. Car HTTP implements car HTTP. And I can implement my methods. And so now I've stubbed in. So now I've overridden my methods. IntelliJ has stubbed in my methods. But here's the problem: is that IntelliJ is just returning null. Well, null could cause me, if I call these in anywhere else in our application, we basically never want to return null because we have the chance of creating a null pointer exception. So now what we need to do to stub this in is we need to go into each one of these and think about, okay, so if somebody was calling get car data, what would we want to return them? Well, we'd want to return them a new array list of actually, what's the syntax for creating a new array list with objects? You guys remember off the top of your head? That's the other annoying thing about Java, right? So in Python, I can just specify brackets, put my objects in, I'm good to go. New my object, seriously? So can I plug in multiple ones? The hell? Really? What do you mean? Oh, I get what you're saying. Yeah, I could hypothetically do that. Yeah, we're going for simplicity here. What I'm going to do is just create just one new car because I know that that'll work. So we'll say new car. Ford F-250 white 1966 string cars. What don't we like here? Make, model, color, year, ID. Ew. Okay. So, year was an int, and then ID is a post ID, right? Make, model, color, year, ID. Make, model, color, year, ID. Let's just do this. List car actually we'll say turn OBS. Now the same thing. So now we've stubbed in that method. That one was a little bit of a pain because we're returning an array list, but with these other ones, it's a little simple. What I can do is just return a quote-unquote auth string, right? Now for the get car details, well, I'm going to return a string, but I'm going to assume that this is coming back in raw HTML. Let's assume that this is coming back in raw HTML, right? And so in my HTML parsing method, I probably want to, maybe I want to code up some kind of test in that. So what I'm going to do is just change this to be some basic HTML, right? And we'll say body, then p class equals escape sequence year 66 p. Okay, so that's basically stubbing, right? So I've stubbed in what the expected value is. That's not null. That if somebody calls one of these methods, even though they're not functioning the way we would expect them to, or they're still they're still functioning the way that we're expecting them to. They're still running, but they're just not actually doing they're not actually fully implemented. So they're stubbed in. One thing that I want to do in each one of these is specify a message to the user that this method isn't implemented yet. We're using a stub instead. Okay, so I save all of that. Now I've created a minor issue in my vehicle's DAO, And if you guys remember where we extracted the interface and we basically redid vehicles DAO, we removed the argument for the data source. So I just need to go in and specify. I need to go in and fix that. Whoa, what are you not happy about? Was DAO array list? Okay. What the hell? Okay, so we're just gonna comment that out because that didn't work anyway. List for class maybe equals DAO. Okay. See what I just had to do there? That's just another example of why I should have had an iVehicle service interface and then implemented that. Any questions on interfaces and stubs? Okay. Any questions about the assignment? How would you guys feel about having lab day, like a lab day next Thursday? So, in fact, we could even do, I'll tell you what, think about it over the next day and a half. If I'm assuming you guys have probably started your assignment. Have you started it? That's a no. All right, so think about it. On Thursday, I'll pose the question. What we could hypothetically do is cover, because I think Thursday's lecture will be short because we're just going to go over unit tests. If you guys really want to, what we can do is next week we're supposed to cover business logic. Business logic is a pretty easy topic, so what we could do is even have like 2 days of lab time next week, or like a day and a half. So Tuesday cover what's remaining of the material for business logic, cover the first half of it this Thursday, cover the second half Tuesday, and then have open lab from that point to the end of class, and then all day Thursday. So think about doing something like that. I'll ask you guys again Thursday. If that's the case, we'll plan for that. So sound good? All right, cool. And I will get the lectures uploaded as soon as possible. So, all right. If no other questions, you guys are free. Have a good one. We'll see you Thursday.